Are you a dark dreamer? Richard Matheson most certainly is. Richard Matheson is one of the most influential and respected fantasists of our time. One of his very first novels, The Shrinking Man, was adapted in 1957 into the classic film, The Incredible Shrinking Man, with Matheson himself supplying the screenplay. Incredibly, nearly all of Matheson's novels have been adapted into motion pictures, including Hell House, Somewhere in Time, What Dreams May Come, and most recently, Stir of Echoes. His 1954 vampire novel, I Am Legend, has been filmed twice to date, first as The Last Man on Earth, starring Vincent Price, and as The Omega Man, starring Charlton Heston. Besides adapting his own novels and short stories, Matheson was also the screenwriter of several original Edgar Allan Poe films in the 1960s, many of which were directed by Roger Corman. Recently, Matheson invited us to his home in the hills overlooking Los Angeles to discuss his life and career, beginning with something called The Twilight Zone. In the late 50s, you became involved in one of the most influential and classic television shows ever produced, The Twilight Zone. And I was wondering if you could tell us what that was like and what was your experience working with Rod Serling.
I knew Rod. Occasionally I would go to his home or we would go out and eat. But I would go in with an idea to see him and Buck Houghton. Later on, I may have just given them the idea over the telephone. I don't know. They would say yes or no, and if they said no, I'd give them another idea. And the first idea I gave them, I remember going in and saying, a World War I pilot gets lost, and he lands, and he's in a modern SAC base. And they said, oh, go home, write it. And they were both very nice men. Rod was as nice as he could be, and being a writer himself, he was very protective of the scripts of the other writers. I don't recall one word of any script ever being changed except by Phyllis Kirk, who more or less said what I wrote, but in her own way for a show that she was in with Keenan Wynn. Otherwise, they all did my lines word for word, and usually very well.
At what point did you meet Roger Corman? You mentioned him briefly with The Intruder. Was it through Chuck Beaumont, or was it some other deal that you fell into writing the Edgar Allan Poe?
Yeah, I was just called in by American International. I didn't even know Roger was involved. I don't think I even met him until later on. And they thought it was going to be a one-shot, The Fall of the House of Usher. And it did so well that, being what they are, of course, they did another and another and another. And some of them were very good. And Roger directed them quite well. Unfortunately, I think he used a lot of his stable of actors, some of whom were not really that good. Vincent Price, of course, was always wonderful as a man and as an actor. He was probably the nicest human being I ever met out here, and there is a definite lack of human beings out here.
But your first two published novels, if I'm not mistaken, were both mystery novels.
Yeah, that was because when I came to California, I stayed at the house of William Campbell Galt, who was a mystery writer. He had just had his first one published, and then through him, I met this group of writers called the Fictioneers. And most of them had come out of the pulp. Some of them were doing Colliers. They did sports, they did mysteries, they did westerns. So I decided I would try a mystery myself. I had never had a great yearning to write a mystery novel, but I wrote a couple, one of which I wrote in 3 days. And then after that, I went back to my first love, fantasy. If I'd stuck to fantasy, science fiction, horror, I'd have done a lot better, been much more successful as a writer, but I always got bored very easily, and I slipped into another, mysteries or then westerns. I've done 5 westerns and a love story, Somewhere in Time, and a novel about afterlife. So the readers that I have must be very loyal because they faithfully trudge from one genre to another following me.
Another classic from that period, produced in 1971, was Duel. And I was wondering if you could relate to us the story of the genesis of that short story, how that came to be.
It happened on the day President Kennedy got assassinated. I was playing golf with a friend of mine over in Moore Park, and when we heard it, we just put our clubs in the car and started home. And as we drove through this pass going home, this truck started tailgating us the whole way. And my friend had to go faster and faster. It was Jerry Soule, who was a well-known science fiction writer. And he finally had to pull off the road in a swirl of dust while this crazy truck driver went roaring by. And we were both infuriated and cursing and sweating. And then my writer's brain kicked in, and I borrowed one of his envelopes of his mail and wrote the idea down for the story. And I didn't write it for, 10 years. And then it was published in Playboy, and then the Universal bought it, and I did the script with George Eckstein as the producer. And then they put this young guy, I remember him saying, they just stuck me with this young hotshot director.
What was his name again?
Spalberg.
One of those one-hit wonders.
It was his first, yeah.
Steven Spielberg.
It was his first, yeah. Yeah, and you could tell right off the bat what an eye he had.
Now, your novel, 1954 novel, I Am Legend, has been filmed not once but twice.
Maybe they're going to do it a third time.
Right, and that's what that's leading up to. Do you have any feelings or thoughts if it does become a third time?
I wish the whole idea would just go away, because I've read the script for the new version, and it's not a bad script at all, but it's no more my book than the other two films were. And I think, why do they bother? Why don't they just make up something of their own? I don't ever expect to see it done. There have been people, Dan Curtis among them, who wanted to do my book just the way it was written. And it got, the rights got so fouled up among so many people that they couldn't get it. Michael Carreras of Hammer Films wanted to do it exactly the way I wrote it. He couldn't get the rights. So I just assumed the whole thing was forgotten. That's why I said, if you have a book, they told Raymond Chandler once about some rather bad film they'd made with one of his novels. They said, gee, isn't it too bad they ruined your book, Mr. Chandler? And he took it off the shelf and said, no, here it is. And that's what the advantage of being a novelist is. And I think probably that helped my career out here. They kind of hold back, and they're a little awed by the fact that you're writing novels too. How can you do that? Script writers, they know they're scum and they can be stepped on. But except
you're a novelist, so you're one level of scum above.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I'm a high level scum.
And since you are wearing what I will call for the moment the professor's cap, could you please basically tell us what advice you would give to someone who is thinking of becoming a writer, either a prose writer in terms of novels or a screenwriter?
Some school teacher just sent me a letter recently saying that he taught a special class of special students, and one of them wanted to be a writer and wanted to know how you go about it. And he asked me if I would write something he could put up on the bulletin board. And what I wrote was, in essence, there are no rules. Ray Bradbury says, write a short story a week for
52 weeks.
52 weeks a year. And that, fundamentally, that's true. You got to write. And I said, create. Don't think about financial success. Don't think about being acclaimed. Don't think about any of it. Just if you really want to write, just write and keep on writing. Later on, if you're good, later on, it'll work out. And usually I have found that, when I was just starting out, I never wrote anybody. I wrote one letter to Ray Bradbury telling him how much I liked his, what became Fahrenheit 451, and he was very gracious when he wrote back to me. But I never guys I graduated from college, they'd say, well, how long are you going to give it? Or the mother of one that would say, when are you going to go get some work?
Yeah.
And I would just stare at them. I had ambitions to do different things, compose, among others, songwrite, among others. I chose writing, and once I had chosen that, nothing anybody told me would mean a thing to me. I would just stare at them blankly and go, right. And I think that's the case with creative people. I'm sure when King was a kid, he was writing stuff. I'm sure when Kuntz was a kid, he was writing stuff. I'm sure they didn't write to other writers and say, how do you do this? They thought, I know how to do it. Just leave me alone. I'll do it my own way. And that's what I usually advise. As far as films, I think Val Lewton probably had a lot of influence on me because I was drawn to that type of film. My mother wouldn't let me go until I was 17. I couldn't listen to The Lone Ranger when I was a kid. You know, I probably had all this bottled up in me, and finally when I got of age, it all came flooding out. Scare people. And I remember seeing Dracula when I was a teenager, and even then, it was not the original release of it, but they were showing it again, and I remember thinking as I sat there, well, if one vampire is scary, what if the whole world was vampires? And that was the genesis of many years later, I Am Legend. And another movie, I forget what it was called, you'll probably remember, with Ray Milland and Aldo Ray. And Ray Milland leaves Aldo Ray's apartment, puts on Aldo Ray's hat, and it comes down way over his ears. And I immediately thought, what if a guy put his own hat on? And it came down there, and he found out he was shrinking. So that's where that is. I would say the majority of my ideas have come from seeing movies, usually poor movies. If they're wonderful movies, you're totally involved. If they're poor movies that have an interesting premise, the premise intrigues you, but you pay very little attention to the movie because it's so bad. And that's when ideas start coming. I regard myself more as a fantasy writer, not as a science fiction writer, because I just sort of backed into it because there was money to be made. Mm-hmm. There were like 40, 50 magazines at that time. And horror, I hate the word horror. Well, to me, the word horror is visceral. It means it makes you sick to your stomach. It's, it can be done brilliantly as an alien with that thing.
Yeah, the chest.
But that's horror. That's horror. Terror gets you in the mind. Val Lewton used to do terror. You don't have to show anything to scare the hell out of people.
And as you know, Boris Karloff always said the same things too. People would say, Mr. Karloff, why do you like making horror movies? And he says, I don't. I make terror movies.
Yeah, he was a charming man, Karloff. He was in a couple of Poe pictures. The second one was the Comedy of Terrors. By then, he could hardly move, and the part was kind of strenuous. He was supposed to play the part that Basil Rathbone played, and he asked if they could switch the parts. And Basil Rathbone was older than him, and he was bouncing all over the place. They were all, to make a picture where you got to talk with Peter Lorre, Vincent Price, Boris Karloff, Basil Rathbone.
Not to mention Hazel Court in some of those films.
Oh, yeah. Well, then Joyce Jameson was in it. She was so... I mean, that's one of the pictures I've always loved that Jacques Tourneur did of mine, the Comedy of Terrors. I personally think it's a very funny picture, and they all loved it. They were so happy to do it, and I watched a lot of the shooting of that. And I spent one whole afternoon, Basil Rathbone telling me all about the duel in Robin Hood. It took them 3 days to shoot the duel. They shot this whole picture in 2 weeks.
Have you given much thought or any thought to how you would like to be remembered after, you're not with us anymore, but the books and movies are?
Well, this fellow, he wrote this book about screenwriters of the 50s. And one of the chapters about me, and the title of it is Storyteller. And I'll settle for that.
Join me here again on the wild side of the imagination, where a sense of wonder and a feeling of terror can often intersect. You'll find us waiting here, the dark dreamers